So after an extensive search, it sure seems like we have come to a conclusion for the next Iowa offensive coordinator. Brian Ferentz out at the end of the season, and now it looks like Tim Lester will be taking over as offensive coordinator. I believe we're still in the multiple reports stage of this, but the former Western Michigan head coach had been on the Packers staff for the 2023 season. Other stops before then also, kind of built him out, the kind of track record that allows you to be able to move up in the industry. So, Tom, what are we to take away from the hiring of Lester as the next Iowa offensive coordinator?
I was surprised by it. Because, we did talk last week on Thursday's show. It sounded like it was going to be Kevin Johns. That was a name that had been reported. And then the other name I had heard connected to the job was Luke Getsy. I had not heard Tim Lester's name connected to the job from anybody. So I was kind of surprised when it broke over the weekend. But I think if you're an Iowa fan, you're probably not that excited about it. I think Kevin Johns was the more kind of enticing option just because of what he was able to do at Duke with Riley Leonard and that kind of stuff. And it felt like it was going to be a different offense. Tim Lester, to me, feels like it's going to be a similar approach to what Iowa did. But there are differences to me in what Brian Ferentz and Tim Lester do. Like, first of all, as I said last week, I don't care who you hire, it's going to be an upgrade. And I do think this is an upgrade at the OC position, because if you look at what Tim Lester did at Western Michigan, like he took over for PJ Fleck, and he was largely successful until his final season there, where they just roster-wise, they didn't have it, and the bottom fell out, and he got fired. But in their passing attack, first of all, like he recruited Jaden Reed to Western Michigan out of the suburbs of Chicago. Jaden Reed had like a freshman All-America season, transfers to Michigan State, ends up getting drafted by the Packers. He inherited a team with Dwayne Eskridge, who then ends up being a second-round pick a few years later after playing in that Tim Lester's offense. He recruited Sky Moore, a very low-rated three-star out of Ohio, who was like a cornerback in high school, puts him at wide receiver when he gets into college, has like 800 yards as a freshman, and then goes on to be a second-round pick of the Kansas City Chiefs. Tim Lester has produced more wide receiver talent in a couple of years at Western Michigan than Brian Ferentz did in his entire tenure at Iowa. And part of that is, if you look at the way Western Michigan's offense operates, they are run heavy. In fact, they ran the ball more during Lester's tenure as the head coach than Iowa did. But they actually have a passing attack that realizes that it doesn't really have difference makers at the receiver position, so it schemes them open. And it's also a little bit more vertical and down the field and aggressive. Like if you look, I looked at all this up. The average air yards on Western Michigan passes during Lester's head coaching tenure was over 10. That's much, and it was also 1.2 yards past the sticks, past the first down marker. Iowa's offense is ranked 116th nationally at 8.1 air yards per attempt and 0.7 behind the sticks. So they were throwing short and kind of relying on yak when they didn't have the guys that you want to have relying on yak outside of your tight ends. But I just think that one coach I talked to, because I can't say I'm overly familiar with Tim Lester's scheme, but one coach I talked to who had faced both Iowa and faced both Western Michigan during their tenure said that that's the primary difference. Iowa ran a lot of flood concepts that work, but they weren't really explosive, and they weren't, like it wasn't really, the spacing was kind of always a little too tight. The Western Michigan pass concepts that they use do a much better job of getting guys open downfield. And the other thing to look at, too, is if you look at the quarterbacks he had at Western Michigan, from John Wisink to Caleb Ellaby, two different quarterbacks, and he had success with both of them. Like Ellaby had a bigger arm and he had more legs. Wisink was more of like a West Coast kind of accuracy, short throw kind of guy. But he was able to mold his offenses around his talent. And I feel like as I've watched Iowa in the Brian Ferentz tenure, we're running one style of offense. You're fitting into it. We're not changing things up based on who we have. We're just so I do think there's going to be more of a dynamic approach, which is not to say he's going to come in and Iowa's going to be throwing the ball all over the field. I just think that there's going to be more of a balance to the offense, in that defenses will have to worry more about the wide receivers in the offense and the passing game, because they just do a better job with their routes to get guys open.
I mean, does it matter?
Well, so all right, does anybody know
all that stuff, and that's all great, and I agree with him. But
does anybody know how many offensive coordinators now What offensive coordinator is Lester for Kirk Ferentz across his 25-year career as
Third?
head coach? He's the fourth.
Fourth. Okay. Yeah. Ken
And
O'Keefe, Brian Ferentz, Tim Lester, and why can't I remember? Oh, Tim Beck.
No, Greg Davis.
Greg Davis. Sorry. Oh, Texas. Got confused there for a second.
Yeah. So I think that's really like when Bud says doesn't matter, that's what you're pointing to, right? That it's still Kirk's offense and the hire does not suggest your expectation should change.
Well, and also, even if Lester's good at developing receivers, Iowa is terrible at recruiting offense outside of the offensive line, like over the last 5 years. So he's not walking into a team that, in my opinion, has a bunch of misused personnel. Right? I think it's going to take some time. There may be some ability to scheme up some stuff that Brian did not do well. Also, how much of this is there? I mean, is Kirk's thumb on the scales or not? Or does he actually let Tim Lester cook? I don't know. Maybe he will. I don't think that they have a whole lot of guys who scare you at receiver. I mean, we've talked to other coaches who are like, yeah, they kind of recruited a MAC level at receiver. So,
but that's why I brought those guys up though, because
right.
They were Mac.
Jaden Reed was not a highly rated prospect out of high school. Sky Moore wasn't a highly rated prospect. Like he found under whatever utilized talent, put him in an offense and develop them. And if you're Iowa, you don't want to bring in an offensive coordinator who's going to need to rely on high-end receiver talent because you don't have any. But Tim Lester has a track record proving he could turn that talent and make useful players out of them.
Iowa fans are under this impression that Caleb Brown is a 5-star receiver. No, was a 5-star receiver. But he did not play at Ohio State. He didn't do a damn thing last year at Iowa. I know he was injured part of the time. But again, if you go somewhere as a 5-star receiver and you don't play, you still have some ability, but clearly like you've not filtered out or filtered through to be a top level guy. So I don't consider Caleb Brown a 5-star type receiver. You know, the schedule is manageable somewhat. Iowa State, Troy, and Illinois State in the non-con. So at least tough defenses there. And then at Minnesota, at Ohio State, host Washington, at Michigan State, host Northwestern, host Wisconsin, at UCLA, at Maryland. You dodge Penn State, you dodge Oregon, you dodge Michigan, you dodge UCLA. But some of those teams could play some defense. Oh, and they get Nebraska too, but that is at home. I don't think they're winning 10 this year.
Is Deacon Hill going to get the job, or does Cade just be able to get that job when he comes back from injury? Because we do have Cade McNamara back for a 6th year after being injured this year. Who, if we're going to have a coach that can Danny, if we're going to have a coach that can develop wide receivers, who's throwing them the football?
I mean, I would hope it's Cade McNamara, not to throw Deacon Hill under the bus, but we saw a lot of it, and it wasn't pretty when the opportunity was there. Tim Lester was the coach 2019 when your boy was on a call the game against Central Michigan. It was Jim McElwain's first year. John Wasink was the quarterback. I liked him personality-wise. He gave me a hat, which I will be forever. I'm a hat guy. Sweet, like camo trucker hat with a Broncos logo. You know, former QBs got to look after each other. But like the Iowa fans that think they were going to get something, I don't know, better or bigger splash, I think are just misguided. But I do think he can tweak things that will keep Kirk Ferentz happy. You know, like you can still run the football. Look at the Lions. The Lions had 2 1,000-yard rushers in the NFL, and they're not perceived as like old school running the football, like boring. You can still run the football and be effective and get creative. And I think that's hopefully what Lester could bring to Iowa.
You can run the football and still have modern day passing concepts instead of the same stuff they were using 15 years ago.
And modern day blocking concepts and different, angles to get the guys on. So I think it comes with all of it.
O-line returns a lot too. So
and gets Caden Proctor.
Yeah, and they're adding him.
Caden Proctor. But I do think too, like we mentioned, does it matter with the offensive coordinators? Like they've been dog shit the last couple of years. And there's absolutely no way you can say they've been anything but. But for most of the last 15 years, Iowa's been a team that scores between 27 and 31 points per game. Like they can have success. And another thing, I was talking to one coach about this who's was very critical of Brian Ferentz's schemes and his game plan, but he also said that with the quarterbacks he had there the last few years, he doesn't know many offensive coordinators who could have done a whole hell of a lot better with that. So,
yeah, like I'm not sure McNamara is any good.
well, he wasn't talking
He's
about
better
Cade. He
than
was
Deacon
talking
Hill.
about Deacon Hill and
For
Spencer.
sure
Petras.
better than Hill. Yeah. If you gave Iowa fans 5-3 against Iowa State, at Minnesota, host Washington, at Michigan State, host Wisconsin, at UCLA, at Maryland, host Nebraska, are they taking that? I'm giving you the 0-1 obviously already on Ohio State. So that would be a 9-3 or a 8-4 type season in your first year without the Big Ten West schedule.
Yeah, you take that, wouldn't you?
Yes.
5-3 against that, I think I would. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, just like Cyhawk's probably more important. You know, like those very few games that can kind of tip your fan sentiment one way or the other.